I stared at the invitation on my kitchen counter for a long time. A real paper invitation, the kind with embossed flowers on the border, addressed to my son and his wife. Not to me. My own son's wedding anniversary dinner, and I'd found out about it because my neighbor Barbara mentioned she'd seen the catering van pull up to his house. That was a Thursday in October. I remember the specific weight of that moment. Not the anger, not yet, just a kind of quiet that settles in your chest when something confirms what you'd been refusing to believe for months. I poured myself a cup of coffee I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table that my wife Helen had picked out 23 years ago. The one with the small burn mark near the corner from a birthday candle that tipped over when our son Warren was 7. I looked at that burn mark for a while. Warren is 34 now. His wife Diane has been in the picture for 6 years, married for 4. I've tried with Diane. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I drove 4 hours to help them move into their first apartment. I built the shelving unit in their living room with my own hands, spent an entire Saturday on my knees with a drill. When Diane had a difficult pregnancy with their first child, I stayed for 2 weeks, cooked every dinner, did the grocery runs, sat up late with Warren when he couldn't sleep from worrying. I did all of that because that's what family does. Or so I believed. My name is Harvey. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, retired 2 years ago with a pension, some savings, and a clear plan for how the back half of my life would look. Part of that plan, maybe the biggest part, involved being present for my son and my 2 grandchildren, Noah, who is 3, and Lily, who just turned 1. What I did not plan for was becoming a financial instrument with a face. It started gradually, the way these things always do. Warren's contracting business had a slow year in 2022. I helped with a mortgage, 2 months, no discussion, because he's my son, and that's what you do. Then Diane's car needed replacing, and their credit wasn't positioned for a good loan rate, so I co-signed. Then the children came, and the daycare costs were, in Diane's words, genuinely criminal, and I started contributing $800 a month toward that. Then their kitchen renovation went over budget, and I covered the gap, $11,000. Then Warren mentioned offhandedly that they were thinking about private school for Noah when he was old enough, and what did I think? And before I knew it, I had agreed to look into it together, which became in Diane's telling a commitment I had made. Over time, I calculated. I had contributed just over $90,000 to their household in 4 years. Not as gifts from a distance, as a presence, as someone who showed up, who drove down on weekends, who took the kids so they could have a night out, who sat at their dinner table and honestly felt, that this was what my retirement was supposed to look like. Then Warren called me last September and said, "Dad, Diane and I have been talking, and we think it would be better if you visited less frequently. She feels like you undermine her parenting." I asked him what that meant, specifically. He said I had let Noah have a second cookie without asking Diane first. I want you to sit with that for a moment. $90,000, 4 years, a burn mark on my kitchen table from a birthday candle that tipped when he was 7, and the charge against me was an unauthorized cookie. I said I understood. I got off the phone. I sat in my living room until it was dark outside and I hadn't turned on any lights. That was September. By October, when I found out about the anniversary dinner through Barbara, I had been to their house exactly once. Warren's birthday, a stiff 2-hour visit where Diane spoke to me in the particular tone that people use when they are performing politeness for an audience. She'd seated me at the far end of the table from the children. When Lily fussed and reached toward me, Diane picked her up and moved to the other room. After the anniversary dinner I hadn't been invited to, I called Warren. He didn't answer. I texted. He responded 2 hours later. "Everything good, Dad? Busy week." I put my phone face down on the counter. The following weekend I drove to their neighborhood. I wasn't going to the house. I just needed to think while moving. And sometimes I drive familiar roads when I'm working something out. I ended up parked half a block away, watching through my windshield as Diane's parents' car sat in the driveway. Her father was pushing Noah on the backyard playset through the gap in the fence. I watched for about 3 minutes before I felt the specific humiliation of a man who was driven to sit outside his son's house like a stranger. And I put the car in drive and went home. I have a younger brother, Miles. He lives in Flagstaff, runs a hardware store, has always been the more plain-spoken of the two of us. I called him that night and described the situation as factually as I could, without editorializing. Miles was quiet for a moment and then said, "Harvey, at what point did Warren tell you he didn't want the money?" I didn't have an answer for that, because in my experience, Miles continued, when someone wants you to stop giving them money, they'll find a way to say it. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up, not with bitterness, more with the particular clarity that comes when someone you trust says a thing out loud that you've been avoiding saying to yourself. November arrived. Warren called to tell me they were doing Thanksgiving with Diane's family this year. Just the four of them and her parents and her sister. He said it in the voice of someone delivering information, not asking permission, not checking in. He said, "I thought you'd want to know so you could make other plans." I said, "I appreciate you letting me know." He said, "Great, Dad. I gotta run." That was a Tuesday. I sat at Helen's kitchen table and I thought about her, which I try not to do too often because it goes to a place I can't always find my way back from. She died when Warren was 19. Breast cancer. 18 months from diagnosis to the end. I raised Warren alone from that point. I drove him to college, helped him pick his major, talked him through 3 breakups, attended every milestone. I'd believed, genuinely, completely believed, that we had the kind of relationship that doesn't require constant maintenance, because it's built on something structural. The way a properly engineered building doesn't need to be rechecked every week. You build it right and it stands. I had apparently built something I didn't fully understand. That Tuesday night, after the Thanksgiving call, I opened my laptop and pulled up my bank's recurring payments portal for the first time in probably 2 years. I had set up so many automatic transfers at different points that I'd stopped tracking them individually. I printed the list. I made myself a cup of tea and sat with it. The daycare contribution, $800 per month. The household support transfer I'd started during the slow year and never formally stopped, $1,200 per month. The private school savings account I'd agreed to fund, together, $500 per month. Warren's truck insurance, which I was still on as a co-payer from a restructured policy 2 years ago, $180 per month. I sat with those numbers, $2,680 per month, flowing out automatically, like a river that carved its channel so gradually you stop noticing the erosion. I called my accountant the next morning. His name is Philip, and he has handled my finances since before Helen died. I asked him to give me an honest assessment. He spent 20 minutes on the phone with me and then said, at the end, "Harvey, this is your money to do with as you choose. But if you're asking me what I would advise a client in your position, you should review your estate documents, and you should establish what your own financial security looks like across a 20 to 30-year horizon before you make additional commitments." Philip had never said anything like that to me before. It landed the way things land when you've needed to hear them for a long time. I contacted my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who has done my estate work for 15 years. I told her I wanted to review everything. The will, the trust documents, the beneficiary designations. She had an opening the following Monday. I spent the weekend before that appointment doing what I'd been avoiding for the better part of a year, looking clearly at my situation, not with anger, not trying to build a case, just looking. Warren was on my will as primary beneficiary. He was named on a small investment account with rights of survivorship. He was listed on the emergency contact for my financial accounts. The house, my house, the one I'd paid off 8 years ago, the one with the kitchen table with the burn mark, had a revocable beneficiary clause that transferred it to him directly upon my death. I had built my entire estate structure around the assumption of a relationship that no longer matched the evidence. Patricia was direct with me in a way I appreciated. She said, "Whatever prompted this review, it's genuinely overdue from a planning standpoint. You have significant assets, you're 63, and you have no clarity on how these should be distributed or protected." We spent 2 hours together. I walked out with a plan. The same week, I canceled the automatic transfers. I did it in order, one at a time, on a Wednesday afternoon in November. The daycare contribution. The household support transfer. The private school account. The insurance co-payment, which required a separate call to the insurance company. Each cancellation had a small confirmation screen with a button that said Confirm Cancellation, and I pressed it 4 times. The fourth time I noticed my hand was completely steady, which surprised me. I wrote Warren a physical letter, because I'm 63 and I still believe some things deserve paper. I told him that I had been reflecting on our relationship and on my own financial situation, and that I had made some adjustments to both. I told him the automatic transfers had been cancelled. I told him I remained available if he wanted to talk. I told him that I loved him, because I do, because that is never the thing that changes. I mailed it on a Thursday. His first call came that Saturday morning. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short and careful, in the voice of someone who has been told by their spouse what tone to use. He said he'd received my letter and would like to talk. I called him back that evening. He led with confusion. He said he didn't understand what had changed. I told him, as clearly and as calmly as I could, that I had been contributing significantly to their household for 4 years, and that over the same period I had gradually been moved to the periphery of my own family's life, and that those two things had finally required me to look at what I was participating in. There was a silence. Then he said, "Diane thinks you've never respected her role as a mother." I said, "Warren, I let Noah have a second cookie." Another silence. I said, "I'm not interested in litigating that. I'm interested in telling you that I love you, and I love your children, and I would like a real relationship with my son and my grandchildren. But I can't continue to fund a version of this family that doesn't include me at the table." He said he needed to talk to Diane. I said I thought that was fine. The calls from Diane's mother started on Sunday. She is a woman named Agnes, perfectly pleasant in ordinary circumstances, the kind of person who brings a casserole when you don't need one and forgets to return your Tupperware. And she has a talent for framing other people's problems as concerns she is volunteering to resolve. She called 3 times. I answered the third time. She said she was sure this was all a misunderstanding, and that Diane was very sensitive, and that she hoped I would consider the children, who adored me. I told her I did consider the children, deeply, and that I hoped my son would call me so we could have a real conversation. She paused and then said, "Well, Harvey, I think Diane feels like you've always made her feel like an outsider in her own family." I said, "Agnes, I built their kitchen shelving with my own 2 hands." She didn't have a response to that. The following week, I flew to Phoenix. I hadn't taken a trip for myself in probably 3 years. There had always been something, some reason to stay available, to be reachable, to not be too far away. I had a college friend, Roy, who'd been inviting me to visit for 2 years. I called him and said I was coming. He sounded genuinely happy in the way that people sound when they've been waiting to hear from you and had started to wonder if they would. I spent 5 days in Phoenix. Roy and I drove out to Sedona one afternoon. I stood in that red light and thought about what the last 4 years had cost me. Not in money, but in the quieter things. The trips I hadn't taken. The mornings I hadn't slept in. Because I was driving to help with something, the way I'd shrunk my own life to fit inside the available space of theirs. I turned 63 in December. Warren called. It was the first real conversation we'd had since the letter, not choreographed and stiff, but something more tentative and honest. He said he'd done some thinking. He said he knew the daycare money and the other support had been significant, and that he and Diane had come to depend on it in a way that wasn't fair to me. He didn't say Diane had come around, and I didn't ask. He said he missed me. I told him I missed him too. I told him I was going to keep the plans I'd made with Patricia, not as punishment, but because I needed to be in charge of my own life. I told him the door wasn't closed, that I wanted to see Noah and Lily, that I wanted to have a real seat at the table, not a transactional one. He said, "I know, Dad, I know." We didn't solve everything in that phone call. I don't think there's a call that solves this kind of thing. What I know is that I drove to his house 2 weeks later and Diane opened the door and she was not warm, not yet, but she stepped aside and let me in. Noah ran into the hallway and crashed into my legs the way small children do when they haven't seen someone they love in a while, and their body moves before their brain catches up. I picked him up. He smelled like the particular shampoo Diane buys from the organic grocery, something with lavender in it, and I stood in that hallway holding my grandson and thought about structural engineering, about how the things that hold are the things built to flex, not the things built to resist. Lily was in the playpen in the living room. She looked at me with the serious, evaluating expression that one-year-olds use for faces they're still filing away. Then she smiled, and it was the best thing I'd seen in a long time. I don't know exactly what the future holds with Warren and Diane. I know that things are different now. Not repaired, exactly, but honest in a way they weren't before. I know that I am flying to see Miles in Flagstaff next month. I know that I've started running again, 3 mornings a week, something I quit when the weekends got eaten up with driving to their house. I know that Helen's kitchen table still has that burn mark near the corner, and that I still sit at it every morning, and that it no longer feels like a place where I'm waiting. I am not waiting anymore. There's a burn mark on my kitchen table that I've never tried to fix. It's from a birthday candle that tipped when Warren was 7, and for a long time I kept it because it made me feel close to something. To the version of our family that existed before so much changed. I used to sit at that table in the mornings and feel anchored by it. Then for a while I sat there and felt only the weight of what I'd been willing to overlook. I've thought a lot about what actually happened over those 4 years, and I don't think it was malice, not entirely. I think it was something quieter and more ordinary than that. The slow drift that happens when generosity goes unacknowledged long enough that it stops feeling like generosity and starts feeling like infrastructure, water pressure, electricity. You don't think about it until it stops. What I did wrong was allow that drift without ever naming it. I kept giving because giving felt like love, and I confused the two so completely that I stopped asking whether the love was actually being received or whether I was just funding a version of closeness that looked real from a distance. That's not a moral failure. But it's a failure of honesty, with them and with myself. The honest thing, the thing that would have served all of us better, was to say early and clearly, I am your father, not your bank. I want to be present in your life, not just useful to it. I didn't say that. I paid the mortgage, and I kept driving down on weekends, and I let a second cookie become a referendum on my character, and I absorbed all of it because I didn't want to be the kind of father who makes things complicated. What finally shifted wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier, actually. Anger moves fast and burns clean. What shifted was something slower. It was the moment I sat outside my son's house in my car and watched another grandfather push my grandson on the playset, and I understood with complete clarity that I had been paying for a family I was not permitted to belong to. That kind of understanding doesn't come from emotion. It comes from finally being willing to see clearly, even when what you see is uncomfortable. That's what I'd been avoiding. Not the conflict, the clarity. There's something I've come to believe about the way consequences work in a life, not in any cosmic or religious sense, just practically, the things you allow, you teach. When I kept funding the arrangement without ever requiring honesty from my son or from myself, I taught Warren that my presence was optional and my money was structural. That wasn't Warren's lesson, to learn alone. It was mine to stop teaching. The moment I canceled those transfers, I wasn't punishing anyone. I was finally telling the truth about what I was and wasn't willing to participate in. And that truth, delivered quietly, on paper, without a raised voice, turned out to be the only thing that actually reached him. Miles told me something in Flagstaff, standing on a ridge watching the sun drop behind the red rocks. He said, "The hardest thing isn't walking away. It's staying present while refusing to disappear." I've been turning that over ever since, because that's what this required. Not absence, not withdrawal, but a kind of firm, clear presence that said, I am here, I am your father, and I will not be reduced. That takes something more than courage. It takes the willingness to let things get worse before they get better. To sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood by someone you love, and to trust that what's real will eventually find its way to the surface. Noah still smells like that lavender shampoo. I ran 3 miles this morning. The burn mark is still on the table. I'm not waiting anymore.